I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Paul Zehr. He is a professor and the director of the Biomedical Research Facility here at UVic. And he has prepared this presentation for you, and I know that many people have seen it, and I've heard nothing but good stuff about it. And this is my first opportunity to see it, so I'm really excited about that.
Great.
Thank you, and turn it over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And welcome to UVic campus. I guess you've been here for a few days already, so it's good to hopefully you've been having good weather at least. You must have brought it with you from wherever you came from. Yeah, good weather where you came from, great. So the talk that what I'm going to talk to you about today is this idea of thinking about what it means if you could think about it really becoming a superhero, using Batman as the metaphor. So the title of the talk today is Becoming Batman, Is There a Superhero in You? I've given different versions of this talk to different audiences, all the way from kids in grade 3 to adults at scientific conferences to Nike, where I was just last month in Beaverton talking to the research and development team. So all over the place giving different aspects on this. And really it's about trying to think about things in a different way. So in fact, what we're going to discuss a little bit, so the preamble before we get into the talk, is using the idea of a comic book icon like Batman, but approaching it through the lens of science to appreciate and think about whether it's realistically feasible, what it would actually mean if it were feasible to actually become Batman through training. So that's where this idea of, is there a superhero in you? Think about what that really means. Now, my own background is in neuroscience and kinesiology. My original scientific training was in kinesiology, and my doctoral training is in neuroscience. This is a photo from my lab that they do, they come and do communications photos, so it looks like we're actually doing an experiment, even though we're not. We have lots of cool stuff in the background, so it looks very sciencey. We have electrodes on things and people's muscles and so on. This is a former graduate student of mine, and we're staring at nothing. It's just a blank panel that we're looking really intent at. It's kind of a stage photo, but we do real work in my lab, trying to understand how the arms and legs interact, and how your arms and legs interact when you walk, and how we can use those interactions to help us recover walking after a stroke. That's a major focus in my lab, which might seem like it's a long ways away from Batman. But in fact, there is a relationship there, and in fact, my earliest scientific studies, this is from some experiments I did back in the early 90s at McMaster University, we're looking at the science of martial arts, and things like cardiovascular stress and heart rate, muscle activation associated with martial arts. It was in fact through martial arts that I got interested in science. I got really interested in how the human body can produce such powerful yet finely controlled movements that we find in martial arts. And I was really fascinated by how that worked. And as a result, since I've been doing martial arts at a very young age, fairly young, at the age of 13, and carried on doing martial arts till now and forward, I was really fascinated by what the body could do. And that got me interested. Well, I want to learn more about it. I tend to, when I get interested in something, I want to learn more about how that thing works. And I've kept doing martial arts. This is a few pictures from a trip a year ago to Japan for some additional training. And we also do weapons-based martial arts as well as empty-hand martial arts. And what I was thinking about when I came up, the link I said between some of the science that I do, how I got into science, and Batman, is the idea that things that are involved in exercise training, and if we think of Batman, and one of the things we'll explore here, is that Batman really represents one of the most highly trained human beings we could ever imagine there being. The principles of how the body works in response to exercise training are the same principles at play when we think about rehabilitation. We're taking things where someone's movements aren't very good, they can't walk very well after a stroke, and they can get better at walking through training. It's the same general idea, just applied at a different level. We call it continuum of performance. So what can happen if somebody is thinking about high-level, ultimate athletic performance like we have in Batman? And since I've also been very interested in the popularization of science and trying to think of different ways to talk about science to different groups of people, like your group and the other ones I mentioned before, I was trying to think of what is the way to combine my own interests and experiences. My own interest, I remember some of the earliest things I read were comic books, and kept reading them over the years. What is there a way to combine all these things together in a certain way? And that's where I came up with this idea of trying to put together science and scientific exploration in an accessible way related to a pop culture icon like Batman. That's where this idea of the book I wrote, Becoming Batman, the Possibility of a Superhero. That's where this came from. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Let's explore that idea. The idea of if there were a possibility of a superhero. Is there a superhero in you? What would it mean if there were? So what I really did with this approach was examine a superhero, put a scientific lens on a superhero. For some superheroes, that wouldn't work very well. Superman wouldn't work very well. He's born on another planet, so already we got a problem. Other superheroes it could work fairly well with. For example, Iron Man. I'll come back to talk about that near the end. But let's say we're talking about Batman here. What I was really looking at was trying to answer what seems like a pretty straightforward question. And that is it actually possible for a human being to gain the skills and abilities of Batman? Batman is a universal, worldwide icon that you mention in any culture. What is Batman? People have an idea of this physical ability that Batman has. He represents the pinnacle of human performance. So he's right at the top in terms of physical abilities. So it's a good person to ask about too, because Batman is not an alien. He's not got superpowers by dint of being hit by lightning or some bizarre radioactive accident. There's nothing supernatural about Batman's powers and how he's shown and pitched in the comics and movies. He seems to be a human being with powers that seem within reach. But are those powers actually within reach was the question I was asking. And how hard would it really be to train to become Batman if you could do so, if it were feasible to even achieve any of that little bit of the superhero-ness that we find inherent in what Batman means to so many people? And in fact, not just how hard would it be, can the human body, can your human body actually respond to the training that would be needed to produce something like Batman? And one of the things I found pretty interesting when I started to look at Batman, when I was doing some of the research for the book I was written, was to sort of study what have other people said about Batman when it comes to his mystique, his background. When you look at some things that some pretty well-known people in the comic book industry, people who've been editors and editors-in-chief and presidents of DC Comics and writers and artists related to Batman, they say some pretty interesting things that are in these quotes here. Just one of the things that pops out, Batman's an ordinary mortal, and he made himself into the best. I always thought Batman, if I could be anything, I wanted to be. So very motivational, inspirational. Yeah, Batman's this human dude, he seems to be able to do all this stuff. Yeah, that's pretty neat. He's a human being bent on a mission. And I like this one from Neil Adams, a very famous Batman artist. Batman's the only superhero who isn't a superhero. He's got no powers. But yet he's got superhero status because of his ability to combine so many high-level training adaptations in his whole body. And somebody else here, Denny O'Neil, a very famous editor and author for DC and Marvel Comics, put it really well by saying he's the most realistic of the great superheroes. He wasn't lightning struck, he didn't bathe in chemicals, he wasn't born on another planet, he didn't have extraterrestrials or gods involved in creating him. He got his abilities the old-fashioned way. He wasn't bequeathed them, he sweated for them. So there's this idea of Batman as having a mystique that seems grounded in our own human experience, and yet is taken to an extreme level, and when put together, represents this achievement of human ability. And that's sort of a thing that all these different people triangulate on if you talk to them or you read what they've written. A little bit more about Batman in case, despite everything I said, in case somebody doesn't know who Batman is. This was actually the first time Batman was shown in the comics. He didn't have his own comic book then, back in May of 1939. He was in a comic book, he appeared in a comic book series called Detective Comics, number 27, very famous comic book. And he was in a story called The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. He sort of just appeared out of nowhere. We weren't really told much about Batman. We just see him and he's doing some things and saving the day, fighting criminals. Does anybody have a copy of this comic book at home, by the way, or maybe your grandparents do or something like that? No? Well, if you come across one of these, I would suggest that you hold on to it. Because just last year, a mint issue of this comic sold for over $1 million. So if you happen to, like, you're cleaning up something at your grandparents' house or at home, and you pick up the couch and there's a comic book like this lying under it, even if it's not in great shape, I would suggest you hold on to it because it's got some pretty good value associated with it. Usually at this point in this talk, and over the last 3 or 4 years, or 3 years when I've been giving these talks, I've spoken to 5,000 or 6,000 people. I usually do a little sort of survey at this point and say, you know, who wants to be Batman? And as we'll see, Batman means also Batgirl, Batwoman. It's an equal opportunity feat for men and women to think of achieving this pinnacle. Anybody in here want to be Batman? Anybody just raise your hand, or Batgirl?